September 1880, Jay Gould paid $250,000 for a Gothic mansion called Lyndhurst overlooking the Hudson River. He was 44 years old and controlled more railroad miles than any other man alive in America. The Vanderbilts despised him for beating them at their own ruthless game and surviving every attack they launched. Newspapers across the country called him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, the destroyer of honest investors. Yet here he stood on 67 acres of manicured grounds, claiming a masterpiece that old money considered their exclusive territory. The mansion featured Gothic towers, designed by America's greatest domestic architect, pointed arches that belonged in European cathedrals, and views that stretched for miles. Gould would fill it with orchids and art and the quiet routines of family life. He would die there 12 years later, still hated by almost everyone. What happens when the most despised man in America builds something beautiful enough to survive him? Jay Gould was born on May 27, 1836, in Roxbury, New York. His father was a failed farmer who couldn't provide enough food for the family. The boy was small and sickly, overlooked by everyone who met him. He educated himself in the local schoolhouse, then taught himself surveying from borrowed books. By 16, he was making maps of Delaware County for $5 apiece. No one looking at this thin, quiet teenager would have predicted what he would become. His first real venture was a tannery in Pennsylvania. He partnered with a leather merchant named Zadoc Pratt, learned the business, then maneuvered his partner out of the company through financial manipulation. The pattern was established early. Gould understood that contracts could be weapons, and that men who trusted too easily lost everything. He was 21 years old when he took control of that tannery. Within a few years, he had sold it and moved to New York City with capital to invest. Wall Street in the 1860s was a battlefield. The Civil War had created fortunes overnight and destroyed them just as quickly. Speculators made millions on government bonds and railroad stocks. The rules were simple: move faster than your opponents, control information others didn't have, and never show weakness. Gould arrived with almost nothing and immediately understood the game better than men who had played it for decades. He found a partner in Jim Fisk, a flamboyant showman who loved attention as much as Gould avoided it. Together they targeted the Erie Railroad, a struggling line that connected New York to the Great Lakes. The Erie was controlled by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the richest man in America and patriarch of the family that would dominate Gilded Age society. Vanderbilt wanted the Erie to complete his railroad empire. Gould and Fisk decided to stop him. What followed became known as the Erie War. Vanderbilt bought Erie stock to gain control. Gould and Fisk responded by printing new shares, flooding the market with paper that diluted Vanderbilt's holdings. The Commodore obtained arrest warrants. Gould and Fisk fled across the Hudson River to New Jersey with $6 million in cash stuffed into bags. They barricaded themselves in a hotel and hired armed guards. When Vanderbilt's agents tried to seize them, Gould simply went to Albany and bribed the New York State legislature to legalize the stock he had printed. The old Commodore lost the fight. He reportedly said of Gould afterward that it never paid to kick a skunk. The Erie War made Gould famous and infamous simultaneously. He had beaten the most powerful man in American business through sheer audacity and willingness to break every rule. Respectable society was horrified. The financial press began calling him names that would follow him for life: Mephistopheles of Wall Street, the most dangerous man in America, a spider spinning webs to trap honest investors. But Gould was just getting started. In 1869, he attempted something even more audacious than fighting Vanderbilt. He tried to corner the American gold market. The plan was elegant and terrifying. Gould began buying gold futures while simultaneously cultivating relationships with people close to President Ulysses Grant. He convinced Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, to lobby the president against selling government gold reserves. If the Treasury held back its gold, the supply would tighten. Prices would rise. Gould would make millions. For weeks, the plan worked perfectly. Gold prices climbed from $130 to $160 per ounce. Gould kept buying, kept pushing, kept waiting for the moment when he could sell at the peak. His partner Jim Fisk was buying even more aggressively, convinced they couldn't lose. Then Grant figured out what was happening. On September 24, 1869, the Treasury announced it would sell $4 million in government gold. The price collapsed instantly. Investors who had bought at the peak lost everything. Banks failed. Businesses closed. The day became known as Black Friday. Thousands of families were ruined by a panic that one small, quiet man had deliberately created. Gould escaped. He had secretly begun selling his position days before the crash, sensing that Grant would eventually intervene. Fisk lost millions. Ordinary investors lost their life savings. But Gould walked away with his fortune intact and his reputation for ruthlessness confirmed beyond any doubt. The newspapers demanded his arrest. Congress held hearings. Witnesses testified about the scheme in detail. Nothing happened. Gould had broken no laws that prosecutors could identify clearly. The system he had exploited was the system itself, and the system protected men who understood how to use it. By 1870, Jay Gould was 34 years old and one of the most hated men in America. The Vanderbilts despised him for the Erie War humiliation. Reform newspapers despised him for Black Friday. Honest investors despised him for proving that the market was rigged against them. Even other robber barons kept their distance, uncomfortable with someone who made their own schemes look almost respectable. Gould didn't care. He had learned something important in Roxbury, watching his father fail at farming while wealthier neighbors prospered. Reputation was worthless if you didn't have power. He would take the power and let others worry about what they called him. Over the next decade, he built an empire. He gained control of the Union Pacific Railroad, the western link of the transcontinental line. He acquired the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, the Wabash. By 1880, he controlled more than 15,000 miles of railroad track, more than any other individual in America. He also bought the Western Union Telegraph Company, giving him control over communications as well as transportation. The combination was devastating to competitors. Gould could move freight on his railroads while his telegraph lines carried information about prices and schedules. He knew what his competitors were doing before they did it. He could undercut their rates, steal their contracts, drive them toward bankruptcy, then buy their assets at discount prices. His methods were legal, mostly. They were also merciless. Towns that refused to grant his railroads favorable terms found themselves bypassed entirely. Competitors who challenged him discovered their stock prices mysteriously falling as rumors spread through financial circles. Journalists who wrote critical articles found their newspapers suddenly losing advertising from companies Gould controlled. The Vanderbilts watched his rise with particular bitterness. The Commodore had died in 1877, still angry about the Erie War. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the fortune and the grudge. William expanded the family railroad holdings and built the massive mansion on Fifth Avenue that announced Vanderbilt's supremacy to New York society. But he couldn't escape the shadow of the small, quiet man who had beaten his father. When reporters asked about Gould, Vanderbilt responses were unprintable. The family considered him beneath contempt, a man without breeding or honor who had clawed his way into their world through fraud and manipulation. They built palaces to prove their superiority. They joined clubs that would never admit someone like Gould. They created a society of old money and proper behavior, designed specifically to exclude new men who had made their fortunes through methods polite people didn't discuss. Gould understood what they were doing. He also understood that he could never win their approval no matter how much money he accumulated. The Vanderbilts would always see him as the Erie War pirate, the Black Friday schemer, the man their patriarch had called a skunk. So he decided to buy something they couldn't take away from him. By 1880, Gould controlled more railroad track than any man alive. He had defeated the Vanderbilts, survived assassination attempts, and become synonymous with Gilded Age greed. Now he wanted something the robber barons couldn't steal or manipulate or destroy through stock market games. He wanted a home worthy of an empire, a place where his family could live away from the hatred that followed him through every business day. He found it overlooking the Hudson River, 40 miles north of Manhattan. A Gothic masterpiece called Lyndhurst, waiting for an owner who could afford to maintain what others had built. Lyndhurst existed for 42 years before Jay Gould ever saw it. The mansion had its own history, its own story of ambition and architectural vision that had nothing to do with railroad wars or gold panics. Understanding what Gould purchased requires going back to 1838, when a different kind of wealthy man decided to build something unprecedented on the banks of the Hudson River. William Paulding was a former mayor of New York City, a respectable figure from an old family with connections to the American Revolution. His grandfather had been a general in the Continental Army. His brother was a congressman. William himself had served as mayor from 1825 to 1826, a position that required social standing as much as political skill. By the late 1830s, he had retired from public life and wanted a country estate worthy of his position. The Hudson River Valley was already becoming fashionable among wealthy New Yorkers. The river provided easy transportation to Manhattan. The views were spectacular. The climate was cooler than the city in summer. Several prominent families had already built estates along the eastern shore. But Paulding wanted something different from the classical Greek revival mansions his neighbors were building. He wanted something romantic. He hired Alexander Jackson Davis, an architect who would become the most important designer of domestic buildings in 19th century America. Davis was 35 years old in 1838, already known for his work on the New York Custom House and several prominent churches. But his true passion was residential architecture, specifically the Gothic Revival style that was just beginning to appear in American buildings. Gothic Revival was a deliberate rejection of classical symmetry. Instead of balanced columns and rectangular windows, it featured pointed arches, asymmetrical towers, and elaborate tracery that recalled medieval cathedrals. In England, the style had been popular for decades. Writers like Horace Walpole had built Gothic fantasy houses. Critics argued that the style was more natural, more spiritual, more connected to landscape than cold classical forms. Davis saw Gothic Revival as perfectly suited to American country estates. The irregular shapes could follow the contours of hillsides. The towers provided dramatic views. The style suggested age and permanence, even when the building was brand new. For Paulding's property overlooking the Hudson, Davis designed a house that would become his masterpiece. He called it Knoll. The original structure was relatively modest by later standards. It cost approximately $20,000 to build, a significant sum but nothing compared to what Gilded Age magnates would spend decades later. The house featured a central block with an asymmetrical tower, pointed arch windows, and a veranda facing the river. The exterior was faced with Sing Sing marble, a local stone that gave the building a gray, weathered appearance, even when newly constructed. Inside, Davis designed everything to match the Gothic theme. The furniture was custom-made with pointed arches and tracery patterns that echoed the architecture. The ceilings featured ribbed vaulting like a medieval chapel. Even the door hardware and light fixtures followed the Gothic vocabulary. Davis believed that a house should be a total artistic environment, every element working together to create a unified effect. Paulding moved into Knoll in 1842. He lived there for the next decade, hosting visitors who came to admire what newspapers called the finest example of Gothic architecture in America. The house attracted attention from architects and tourists alike. Davis published drawings of it in pattern books that influenced domestic design across the country. Knoll proved that Gothic revival could work for American homes, not just churches and universities. William Paulding died in 1854. His son Philip inherited the estate but had no interest in maintaining it. Within a few years, the property was for sale, waiting for a buyer who could appreciate what Davis had created and afford to maintain it properly. That buyer arrived in 1864. George Merritt was a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in the dry goods trade. He purchased Knoll and immediately commissioned Davis to expand it dramatically. The architect was now 60 years old, returning to his greatest residential work with resources the original client could never have provided. The expansion took nearly 2 years. Davis doubled the size of the house, adding a massive new tower that rose 60 feet above the landscape. He extended the north wing to create a grand dining room and expanded the south wing for additional bedrooms. The exterior received new decorative elements, more elaborate tracery, additional pointed arches, carved details that made the original building look almost plain by comparison. Merritt also renamed the estate. Knoll became Lindenhurst, after the linden trees that lined the entrance drive. The name would eventually be shortened to Lyndhurst, the form that survives today. The expanded mansion now contained approximately 40 rooms. The grounds covered 67 acres. Davis designed a massive greenhouse complex, one of the largest in private hands in America, where Merritt grew exotic plants year-round. The cost of Merritt's expansion was never publicly disclosed, but estimates suggest he spent at least $100,000 on construction alone. Add furnishings, landscaping, and the greenhouse, and the total investment likely exceeded $200,000. This was a fortune by Civil War standards, though still modest compared to what would come in the Gilded Age. What made the expansion remarkable was the continuity of vision. Davis had designed the original house in 1838. He designed the expansion in 1865. The 27-year gap might have produced a jarring clash of styles if different architects had been involved. Instead, the all-expanded Lyndhurst felt like a single coherent creation, as if it had always been this large and elaborate. Merritt enjoyed his Gothic palace for only a few years. He died in 1873, and his widow sold the estate in 1880. The buyer was Jay Gould. If you enjoy exploring the rise and fall of American dynasties, consider subscribing to the channel. The purchase price was $250,000, roughly the same as Merritt had invested over his years of ownership. Gould was buying a fully developed estate with one of America's finest houses, 67 acres of designed landscape, and a greenhouse complex that could support his emerging interest in orchid cultivation. He was also buying something money couldn't create from scratch: history and architectural significance that predated his own controversial career. The Vanderbilts built new palaces to announce their supremacy. They hired architects to design showcases for their wealth, structures that proclaimed how much money they could spend. Marble House and the Breakers were monuments to the present, statements of current power that happened to be built in historical styles. Gould did something different. He purchased a masterpiece that already existed, a house designed by America's greatest domestic architect for clients who had nothing to do with railroad wars or stock manipulation. Lyndhurst had been famous before Gould was born. It would be famous after he died. The mansion's significance didn't depend on its owner's reputation. This was either brilliant strategy or genuine appreciation for beauty. Perhaps both. Gould understood that he could never win acceptance from families like the Vanderbilts. Their hatred was too deep, too personal, rooted in defeats that would never be forgiven. But he could own something they had to respect, a house that architectural critics and historians would study long after the Erie War and Black Friday were forgotten. By 1880, Lyndhurst was already legendary. A Gothic jewel overlooking the Hudson, designed by America's greatest domestic architect, expanded into something approaching a castle. Jay Gould had paid $250,000 for it. The question wasn't whether he could afford such a purchase. The question was whether a man like him deserved to own it, and what he would do with a masterpiece built for better men. Telegraph wires ran directly into Lyndhurst from the moment Jay Gould took possession. While other wealthy men used their country estates to escape business, Gould transformed his Gothic mansion into the nerve center of an empire. From his study overlooking the Hudson River, he could send orders to railroad offices across the continent. Stock prices, shipping schedules, competitor movements, all flowed through those wires into the medieval-style rooms where A.J. Davis had imagined lords and ladies, not railroad magnates. The contrast was jarring if you stopped to think about it. Here was a house designed to evoke 12th century England, filled with pointed arches and ribbed vaulting and furniture carved to look centuries old. And here was Jay Gould, the most modern man in America, using it as a command post for manipulating markets that hadn't existed when the house was built. The Gothic fantasy and the industrial reality coexisted without apparent conflict. Gould's daily routine at Lyndhurst bore no resemblance to his public reputation. He rose early, often before dawn, and ate simple meals that his doctors had prescribed for his increasingly fragile health. He rarely drank alcohol. He never smoked. The man newspapers called a predator and a pirate lived like a monk in his castle, working quietly while his competitors imagined him plotting destruction in some smoke-filled room. His family life was similarly unexpected. Gould had married Helen Day Miller in 1863 before he became famous or infamous. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, a quiet woman who avoided publicity as carefully as her husband attracted it. They had 6 children together. George was the eldest son, expected to inherit the business empire. Edwin and Howard followed. Then came Helen, named for her mother, and Anna. The youngest was Frank, born in 1877. At Lyndhurst, Gould was a devoted father in ways that surprised everyone who knew him only from newspaper accounts. He took his children on walks through the 67 acres of grounds. He taught them about the plants in his greenhouse. He read to them in the library under the ribbed ceiling that Davis had designed to echo medieval cathedrals. Visitors who expected to find a ruthless schemer instead encountered a small, soft-spoken man who seemed happiest when surrounded by orchids and children. The orchids became his obsession. Gould had become interested in the flowers sometime in the early 1880s, perhaps as a hobby to distract from business pressures. At Lyndhurst, he had the resources to indulge that interest completely. The greenhouse complex that George Merritt had built was already one of the largest in private hands. Gould expanded it further, adding structures and heating systems that could maintain tropical temperatures year-round. By the mid-1880s, he had accumulated one of the finest orchid collections in America. Visitors reported seeing thousands of plants in dozens of varieties. Some had been collected from the jungles of South America and Central America. Others came from specialized nurseries in Europe. The cost of maintaining this collection was substantial. Heating the greenhouses through Hudson Valley winters consumed enormous amounts of coal. Skilled gardeners worked year-round to tend plants that would die within days if conditions varied. The collection eventually grew to include over 8,000 orchid plants. This made it one of the largest private collections in the world at the time. Gould corresponded with orchid specialists across the country. He competed to acquire rare specimens. He took genuine pleasure in the beauty and complexity of flowers that had nothing to do with railroads or telegraph lines. Some historians have interpreted the orchid obsession as evidence of Gould's hidden aesthetic sensitivity. Others see it as another form of competition, a way to dominate a field where his business reputation couldn't follow. Perhaps both interpretations are true. Gould collected orchids the way he collected railroad companies, systematically and comprehensively, but he also clearly loved them in a way he never loved the businesses that made his fortune possible. His wife Helen managed the household while Jay focused on business and orchids. She oversaw the servants, organized the family's social calendar, and raised 6 children in an environment that mixed Gothic architecture with cutting-edge technology. The house had electric lighting installed in the 1880s, making it one of the first private residences in America with this modern convenience. Telegraph and telephone lines connected the estate to the outside world, yet the rooms themselves looked like they belonged in a different century. Helen Gould rarely appeared in newspapers and left few records of her own thoughts. She seems to have accepted her husband's controversial reputation without complaint. Whatever Jay did in the business world, he came home to Lyndhurst as a husband and father first. The private man and the public monster coexisted in the same body, walking through the same Gothic corridors. Gould's health had never been robust. As a young man, he had suffered from various ailments that kept him thin and pale. By the 1880s, tuberculosis had begun destroying his lungs. He coughed frequently. He tired easily. The walks through Lyndhurst's grounds grew shorter. More time was spent in the greenhouse, where the warm, humid air seemed to ease his breathing temporarily. The disease progressed steadily through the decade. Gould continued working, continued manipulating markets, continued adding to his railroad empire. But those who saw him regularly noticed the decline. He grew thinner. His face took on the gaunt appearance that tuberculosis victims typically developed. He spent more time at Lyndhurst and less in his New York offices, conducting business through the telegraph wires rather than in person. The irony was profound. America's most aggressive capitalist, the man who had cornered gold and stolen railroads and survived every attack his enemies launched, was being killed slowly by microscopic bacteria. All his wealth couldn't cure tuberculosis. All his power couldn't stop the disease from consuming his lungs cell by cell. He could manipulate stock markets, but not his own mortality. By the late 1880s, Gould had largely retreated to Lyndhurst. He still controlled his empire through telegrams and trusted associates. He still made decisions that moved millions of dollars. But his body was failing, and everyone who knew him understood that the end was approaching. The Gothic mansion that he had purchased as a refuge was becoming something else. It was becoming the place where Jay Gould would spend his final years, surrounded by his orchids and his family, waiting for a death that all his money could only postpone. The house that A.J. Davis had designed to look ancient was now home to modern tragedy. The towers and pointed arches that suggested medieval permanence contained a man whose time was running out. Gould had built an empire that would outlast him. The question was what that empire would mean once its creator was gone, and whether the mansion he loved would survive the hatred he had earned. The art gallery alone was 100 feet long. Visitors entering through the main hall at Lyndhurst found themselves in a space that rivaled the display rooms of public museums. Skylights flooded the gallery with natural illumination during daylight hours. Paintings covered the walls from eye level nearly to the ceiling. Jay Gould had accumulated a collection that his enemies couldn't dismiss regardless of how much they hated the collector. The gallery occupied a wing that George Merritt had added during his 1865 expansion. A.J. Davis had designed it specifically for displaying art, understanding that wealthy Americans increasingly wanted spaces to showcase their cultural acquisitions. The proportions were deliberately overwhelming. A visitor was meant to feel small, surrounded by masterpieces, humbled by the accumulated evidence of taste and wealth. Gould filled this space with paintings that demonstrated his understanding of what constituted respectable art in the Gilded Age. European old masters hung alongside American landscapes. Portraits of historical figures shared walls with pastoral scenes and classical mythology. The collection was conservative in its choices, exactly the kind of art that established families displayed to prove their cultivation. Nothing challenged viewers or suggested dangerous originality. This conservatism was deliberate. Gould couldn't change his reputation as a financial pirate, but he could surround himself with evidence that suggested refinement. The paintings were a form of armor, protection against accusations that he was nothing more than a clever manipulator without genuine culture. When critics attacked his business methods, the art gallery stood as silent rebuttal. Would a barbarian collect such beauty? Beyond the gallery, the Gothic interiors that Davis had designed remained largely unchanged from previous owners. The pointed arches framed doorways and windows throughout the house. Ribbed vaulting covered ceilings in the main rooms. The furniture that Davis had designed specifically for the house still occupied its original positions. Every piece featured Gothic details that echoed the architecture, creating the unified environment Davis had envisioned decades earlier. The dining room demonstrated this integration perfectly. The table could seat a dozen guests comfortably. Above them, the ceiling featured elaborate wooden tracery painted in colors that suggested medieval manuscripts. The windows were pointed arches filled with leaded glass that filtered light into patterns on the floor. Family portraits hung on walls paneled in dark wood. Here the Goulds ate their simple meals surrounded by decoration that suggested centuries of aristocratic tradition. The contrast with Newport's Gilded Age palaces was striking. The Vanderbilts at the breakers surrounded themselves with Italian Renaissance splendor. Marble and gilt and platinum announced their supremacy through sheer material excess. Every surface proclaimed wealth in the loudest possible terms. The message was clear. We can afford this, and you cannot. Lyndhurst made a different statement. The Gothic style suggested age and permanence, rather than immediate wealth. The dark wood and pointed arches whispered of medieval castles and ancient lineages. Davis had designed the house to look like it had always existed, as if generations of occupants had passed through its corridors. Gould was simply the latest custodian of something larger than himself. The library occupied a prominent position on the first floor. Bookshelves lined the walls beneath another ribbed ceiling. Davis had designed built-in cabinets that integrated seamlessly with the Gothic vocabulary of the house. The books themselves were bound in leather and arranged by subject. Whether Gould actually read them remains uncertain. What mattered was their presence. The visual evidence of a cultured household. A massive fireplace dominated one wall of the library. The carved stone mantel featured Gothic tracery that matched the ceiling above. On cold evenings, the fire would have cast flickering shadows across the ribbed vaulting, creating an atmosphere that genuinely suggested medieval halls. The effect was theatrical, but also genuinely impressive. Davis understood how to manipulate light and shadow to enhance his architectural effects. The bedrooms on the upper floors continued the Gothic theme with somewhat lighter touches. Guest rooms featured pointed arch windows and appropriate furniture, but the decoration was less overwhelming than the public spaces below. These were rooms for sleeping, not impressing visitors. The family's private quarters were similarly restrained, comfortable, rather than theatrical. The grounds surrounding the house extended the Gothic atmosphere outdoors. Davis and subsequent landscape designers had created views that framed the mansion dramatically. Visitors approaching from the main drive saw the tower rising above the trees, exactly like a castle appearing through forest. Paths wound through the 67 acres, offering carefully composed views of the Hudson River below. The greenhouse complex represented a different kind of display entirely. While the main house looked backward to medieval Europe, the greenhouses showcased the latest Victorian technology. Steel frames supported walls of glass. Heating systems maintained tropical temperatures regardless of Hudson Valley winters. The structures were purely functional, designed to keep exotic plants alive rather than to impress with architectural beauty. But the contents were meant to impress. Gould's orchid collection filled multiple greenhouse buildings. Visitors reported seeing aisles of flowering plants stretching into apparent infinity. The colors ranged from pure white through every shade of pink and purple to deep crimson. The fragrances blended into something overwhelming, almost narcotic. This was excess of a different kind than marble. Palaces, but excess nonetheless. The collection included specimens that had been collected from remote jungles at enormous expense. Professional plant hunters had traveled to South America and Southeast Asia seeking rare varieties. Each successful expedition added to Gould's holdings. By the late 1880s, he owned over 8,000 orchid plants representing hundreds of species. The maintenance cost was astronomical. Heating alone consumed hundreds of tons of coal annually. Staff worked year-round to maintain both house and grounds. The exact number of servants at Lyndhurst is difficult to determine from surviving records, but estimates suggest between 20 and 30 during the Gould years. This included household servants, gardeners, groundskeepers, and specialized greenhouse workers. Compared to Newport palaces that employed 50 or more, Lyndhurst was modestly staffed, but the costs still accumulated relentlessly. The property taxes, insurance, heating, staff salaries, greenhouse operations, art acquisition, and general maintenance consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Gould could afford it easily during his lifetime. His fortune was estimated at over $70 million at its peak. The annual cost of Lyndhurst barely registered against such wealth, but fortunes can shrink faster than estates can be downsized. Jay Gould had created something remarkable at Lyndhurst, a Gothic masterpiece filled with art and orchids and the quiet rhythms of family life. A monument that proved he could appreciate beauty even if society refused to appreciate him. The house stood as evidence that the most hated man in America was more complicated than newspaper caricatures suggested. He would enjoy it for 12 years after purchasing it. Then tuberculosis would claim him, and the question of what happens to beautiful things built by despised men would finally require an answer. The Gothic towers would still rise above the Hudson. The orchids would still bloom in their heated greenhouses. But everything else was about to change. Jay Gould died on December 2, 1892, at his townhouse on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. He was 56 years old. The tuberculosis that had been destroying his lungs for years finally completed its work. His family surrounded him at the end. The children he had raised at Lyndhurst watched their father slip away in a bedroom far from the Gothic towers and orchid greenhouses he loved. The funeral was remarkable for what it lacked. There was no lying in state. There was no public ceremony. There was no procession through streets lined with mourners. Jay Gould had been one of the most famous men in America, and his death was handled with the privacy of an ordinary citizen. The family wanted it that way. They understood that public grief would have been met with public celebration by the many people who had spent decades hating their father. Wall Street's reaction confirmed their fears. When news of Gould's death reached the financial district, traders reportedly cheered. Stock prices rose on the assumption that markets would be safer without him. Newspapers that had spent years attacking him published obituaries that read more like indictments than memorials. The New York Times called him a man who had done incalculable harm to American business. Other publications were less restrained. The contrast with Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death 7 years later would be striking. When Vanderbilt died in 1899, the nation mourned. Flags flew at half-staff. Tributes poured in from business leaders and politicians. The Vanderbilt name commanded respect even in death. The Gould name commanded only continued contempt. Jay Gould's will divided an estate valued at approximately $77 million among his 6 children. This was an enormous fortune by any measure, though already smaller than it had been at its peak. Each child received roughly equal shares, with George J. Gould II, the eldest son, taking on additional responsibilities for managing the family's business interests. Lyndhurst passed to George, along with most of the railroad and telegraph holdings. At 30 years old, George had been groomed to succeed his father, trained in the complexities of managing railroad empires. He had the Gould name, the Gould money, and access to the Gould business network. What he lacked was his father's genius for manipulation and survival. The children faced an impossible inheritance in more ways than one. They had money, enormous amounts of it. They also had a name that opened no doors in polite society. The Vanderbilts and their allies continued to treat the Goulds as outcasts, regardless of how much wealth they possessed. The hatred that had followed Jay Gould through his business career would follow his children through their social lives. Helen Gould, the eldest daughter, responded to this situation by becoming one of the most generous philanthropists in American history. She was 24 years old when her father died. She had inherited approximately $12 million outright plus income from various trusts. She would spend the rest of her life giving most of it away. Her philanthropy began almost immediately after Jay's death. She donated money to the YMCA, funding buildings across the country. She supported hospitals and orphanages. She gave to educational institutions that would accept money from a Gould. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, she donated $100,000 to the government for military hospitals. When that proved insufficient, she gave more. The pattern continued for decades. Helen Gould reportedly gave away over $50 million during her lifetime. She funded churches, schools, and charitable organizations of every description. She became known as the most generous woman in America, a reputation that gradually softened public perception of the Gould name. If Jay had been the robber baron, Helen was the redeemer. She never married until 1913, when she was 45 years old. Her husband was Finley Shepard, a railroad executive who had worked for companies her family controlled. The marriage was happy but late. Helen had spent her youth managing her inheritance and building her reputation for charity. Romance had waited while redemption took priority. Lyndhurst remained in family hands throughout these years, though Helen didn't live there full-time. George occupied the mansion as primary residence initially, attempting to use it the way their father had. Telegraph lines still connected the Gothic study to business offices across the country. George still tried to manage the railroad empire from the house on the Hudson. But George lacked his father's touch. His business decisions were consistently poor. He invested in railroad expansion projects that failed. He competed against stronger opponents and lost. The fortune that Jay had spent decades building began eroding almost immediately under his son's management. By 1900, George's failures were becoming apparent. The family's railroad holdings were worth less than they had been at Jay's death. Competitors had taken market share. The empire was shrinking. George kept trying to replicate his father's success through aggressive speculation. He kept failing. The other children fared differently. Edwin and Howard pursued their own interests with varying success. Anna married a French nobleman, Bonny de Castellane, in 1895. The marriage was spectacularly unhappy. Castellane was a fortune hunter who spent Anna's money on Parisian luxuries while treating her with contempt. She divorced him in 1906 and later married his cousin, the Duke of Talleyrand-Périgord. The second marriage was happier, though it produced no children. Frank, the youngest Gould child, became something of a playboy. He invested in hotels and casinos on the French Riviera. He married multiple times. He lived well but contributed little to preserving the family's American legacy. The pattern was familiar to anyone who studied Gilded Age dynasties. The founder built a fortune through ruthless focus and exceptional ability. The second generation inherited the money, but not the skills. The fortune eroded through bad decisions, expensive lifestyles, and division among too many heirs. The Vanderbilts were experiencing the same decline, though from a higher starting point. Lyndhurst's maintenance costs continued regardless of the family's shrinking resources. The greenhouse complex required constant heating. The grounds required constant tending. The house itself demanded attention and investment, staff salaries, property taxes, insurance, repairs. The Gothic mansion consumed money as steadily as it had under Jay Gould, but now the income supporting it was diminishing rather than growing. George continued occupying Lyndhurst through the early 20th century, but his financial position deteriorated steadily. By the time of his death in 1923, the family's business empire had largely collapsed. The railroads Jay had controlled were in other hands. The telegraph company had merged with competitors. The fortune that had once rivaled the Vanderbilts had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Helen outlived her brother and continued her philanthropic work until her death in 1938. She had given away more money than most families ever possessed. Her reputation had largely redeemed the Gould name in the eyes of charitable organizations and religious institutions that had benefited from her generosity. But she couldn't give away the fundamental problem. Lyndhurst still stood on its hill above the Hudson, still requiring money to survive, still carrying the complicated legacy of the man who had purchased it. The mansion passed to Anna, Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord, the only surviving Gould sibling. She was 75 years old, living in France, and had no particular interest in maintaining an American Gothic estate. The question that had hovered over Lyndhurst since Jay Gould's death was finally becoming urgent. What do you do with a beautiful monument when no one in the family can afford to keep it alive? Helen Gould inherited something more complicated than money when her father died. She inherited a name that decent people wouldn't speak in polite company. She inherited a reputation that preceded her into every room she entered. She inherited the burden of being Jay Gould's daughter in a society that had decided Jay Gould represented everything wrong with American capitalism. Her response was systematic redemption. From the moment she gained control of her inheritance, Helen began giving it away. The YMCA received her first major donations. She funded construction of buildings in cities across the country, providing spaces where young men could find wholesome recreation instead of saloons and gambling halls. The organization celebrated her generosity publicly, helping establish her reputation as a philanthropist rather than a robber baron's child. The giving accelerated through the 1890s. Helen supported hospitals that served the poor. She funded orphanages and schools. She donated to churches of multiple denominations, understanding that religious institutions would vouch for her character in ways that secular organizations could not. Each gift was publicized carefully. Each donation pushed the Gould name slightly further from its association with Black Friday and railroad manipulation. Her lifestyle reinforced the message. While other Gilded Age heiresses competed to display their wealth through jewelry and gowns and elaborate parties, Helen dressed modestly. She avoided the social circuit that Newport and Fifth Avenue society considered essential. She attended church regularly and spoke publicly about her Christian faith. Everything about her presentation announced that she was different from her father, different from the greed and manipulation that had made his fortune possible. The Spanish-American War in 1898 provided her most dramatic opportunity. When the United States went to war with Spain, Helen donated $100,000 for military hospitals. The gift was announced widely. Newspapers that had spent years attacking her father now praised his daughter's patriotism. When the initial donation proved insufficient for the scale of casualties, she gave more. By the war's end, she had contributed over $250,000 to military medical care. The war donations transformed her public image permanently. Helen Gould became a symbol of American generosity, her father's crimes largely forgotten in the celebration of her charity. Magazines published admiring profiles. Social organizations that would never have accepted Jay Gould welcomed his daughter as a patron and member. The rehabilitation was nearly complete. Lyndhurst remained in the background during these years. Helen maintained a connection to the estate, but didn't live there full-time. Her brother George occupied the mansion as primary residence, Attempting to continue their father's business operations from the Gothic study, Helen visited regularly, walking the grounds where she had spent her childhood, tending the orchid collection that Jay had loved. But her main residence was elsewhere, closer to the charitable organizations that consumed her attention. She watched George's failures with growing concern. Her eldest brother had inherited their father's ambition but not his judgment. The railroad investments that Jay had managed successfully became traps under George's direction. Competitors outmaneuvered him. Markets moved against his positions. The family fortune that had seemed so vast in 1892 was visibly shrinking by 1900. Helen continued giving away her own share, regardless of what happened to George's holdings. Her philanthropy didn't depend on the family business empire surviving. She had sufficient income from trusts and investments to maintain her charitable work indefinitely, but she understood that the family's collective position was weakening. The days when Goulds could compete with Vanderbilts in wealth, if not social standing, were ending. George died in 1923, leaving behind debts and a tarnished reputation. The railroad empire Jay had built was gone. The business genius that had made the Gould name feared on Wall Street had not passed to the next generation. Helen was 63 years old, still giving away money, still working to redeem a name that her brother's failures had damaged anew. She continued her philanthropic work for another 15 years. The Great Depression devastated many fortunes, but Helen had already given away so much that the crash affected her less than others. She lived modestly, maintained her charitable commitments, and watched the world she had known disappear. The Gilded Age certainties about wealth and position were collapsing everywhere. The palaces that families like the Vanderbilts had built were being demolished or abandoned. The era of private fortunes large enough to sustain private empires was ending. Helen finally married in 1913 at age 45. Her husband Finley Shepard was a railroad executive, appropriately enough. The marriage was quiet and late, a companionship for her final decades rather than a society event. They had no children. Helen's legacy would be the institutions she had funded, not descendants who might carry the Gould name forward. She died on December 21st, 1938, at age 70. Obituaries celebrated her as one of the greatest philanthropists in American history. Estimates of her lifetime giving exceeded $50 million. She had funded hundreds of buildings, supported thousands of students, helped countless families through organizations she had endowed. The woman who had inherited one of America's most hated names had transformed it through sheer persistence into something respectable. Lyndhurst passed to her sister Anna, the Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord. Anna was 75 years old, living in France, married to European nobility. She had spent most of her adult life far from the Hudson River estate where she had grown up. The Gothic mansion was a childhood memory, not a functioning part of her current life. The situation was impossible. Anna had no interest in maintaining an American estate. She had no children who might want it. The costs of upkeep continued regardless of whether anyone occupied the house. Property taxes, insurance, staff salaries, greenhouse heating, grounds maintenance. The expenses that Jay Gould had paid easily from railroad profits now fell on an elderly widow with diminishing resources. The family fortune that had once exceeded $70 million had been divided among 6 children, spent down through bad investments and expensive lifestyles, eroded by decades of mismanagement. What remained was insufficient to maintain Lyndhurst properly. Anna could afford to keep the house from collapsing, but just barely. She couldn't afford to restore it, or improve it, or make it live again as a functioning estate. Other Hudson River mansions were facing the same arithmetic during these years. Families that had built elaborate estates in the 19th century were discovering that their descendants couldn't afford the maintenance. Some houses were sold for demolition, their materials salvaged for whatever they would bring. Others were simply abandoned, left to decay, while heirs fought over what to do with increasingly worthless property. Lyndhurst stood on the edge of this fate. The Gothic masterpiece that A.J. Davis had designed, that George Merritt had expanded, that Jay Gould had filled with art and orchids, was in danger of joining the list of demolished monuments. Anna had to make a decision. She could sell the estate to developers who would tear it down. She could continue struggling to maintain it with inadequate resources, or she could find another solution entirely. The question wasn't really about the house. It was about what the house meant. Did the Gould legacy deserve preservation? Did a monument built by one of America's most hated men merit the effort required to save it? Helen had spent her life trying to redeem the family name through charity. Now the family home itself needed redemption of a different kind. Anna Gould, Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord, faced an impossible choice from her home in France. She was 75 years old when Helen died in 1938. She had inherited a Gothic mansion on the Hudson River that she barely remembered from childhood visits decades earlier. The estate required constant expenditure just to survive. Anna had resources, but not unlimited ones, and she had no heirs who might want the property after she was gone. The 1940s were brutal years for historic American estates. World War II consumed the nation's attention and resources. Wealthy families who had once maintained summer cottages and country houses found themselves facing new tax burdens and reduced incomes. The servant class that had made such properties functional was disappearing as workers found better opportunities in factories and offices. Running a mansion like Lyndhurst required staff that simply couldn't be hired at any price during wartime. Anna kept Lyndhurst minimally maintained through the war years. Caretakers watched over the property. Basic repairs prevented immediate collapse, but the house wasn't really lived in. The Gothic rooms that Jay Gould had filled with art and Helen had visited regularly stood empty. The orchid collection that had once numbered over 8,000 plants had long since died or been sold. The greenhouses that required constant heating fell into disrepair. The post-war years brought no relief. The economic boom that lifted most Americans did nothing for owners of white elephant estates. Property taxes rose, maintenance costs increased. The gap between what Lyndhurst required and what Anna could reasonably provide widened steadily. She was now in her 80s, living in France, managing an American property through letters and occasional visits. The situation was unsustainable. Other Hudson River estates were disappearing during these years. The great houses that railroad barons and industrialists had built in the 19th century were being demolished one after another. Families that couldn't afford maintenance sold to developers who saw more value in the land than in the buildings. The wrecking ball came for mansions that had once hosted presidents and princes. Stone and timber and decorative elements were salvaged and sold. Then the sites were cleared for more profitable uses. Lyndhurst could easily have joined that list. The property had significant value as real estate. Developers would have paid good money for 67 acres overlooking the Hudson River, so close to New York City. The house itself, despite its architectural significance, was worth less than the land it occupied. A rational economic calculation suggested demolition as the obvious solution. Anna refused. Whatever her feelings about the family history or her distant relationship with the property, she wouldn't be the one who destroyed A.J. Davis's masterpiece. The house had been famous before Jay Gould purchased it. It deserved to survive regardless of what people thought about the family that had owned it for 80 years. The National Trust for Historic Preservation offered an alternative. The organization had been founded in 1949, created by congressional charter to preserve historic buildings and sites across America. It was a new institution, still finding its footing, but it represented a growing recognition that the country's architectural heritage was being lost to development and neglect. Someone needed to save what private owners could no longer afford to maintain. The trust approached Anna about Lyndhurst sometime in the 1950s. The conversations continued for years, working out the details of what a transfer might look like. Anna wanted assurances that the house would be preserved properly. The trust needed to understand what it was acquiring and how it would fund ongoing maintenance. Both parties moved slowly, carefully, understanding that the decision would be permanent. The final arrangement was completed in 1961. Anna donated Lyndhurst to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The gift included the mansion, all its contents, and the 67 acres of surrounding grounds. She retained no ownership stake, no right to future use, no control over how the property would be managed. The Gothic house that her father had purchased 81 years earlier passed out of Gould family hands forever. Anna died later that same year, 1961. She was 97 years old. She had been born into one of America's wealthiest families and lived long enough to see that wealth almost completely dissipate. Her father had controlled railroads and telegraph companies worth tens of millions. Her brother had lost most of it through bad management. Her sister had given away enormous sums, trying to redeem the family name. Now the family home belonged to a charitable organization. The Gould era was over. The donation saved Lyndhurst from almost certain demolition. Without the National Trust's intervention, the property would likely have been sold and destroyed within a few years. Anna's resources were exhausted. No other family member had interest or ability to take on the burden. The house that A.J. Davis had designed would have become another casualty of changing times and impossible economics. Instead, it became one of the National Trust's flagship properties. The organization began restoration work almost immediately. They repaired deferred maintenance, stabilized deteriorating elements, and prepared the house for public visitation. The Gothic mansion that had been a private family retreat would now welcome paying visitors who wanted to see how America's wealthy had lived in the Gilded Age. The irony was significant. Jay Gould had purchased Lyndhurst partly to establish his family's place among America's elite. The Vanderbilts and their allies had built palaces that announced their supremacy to anyone who could see them. Gould wanted a masterpiece of his own, something that proved his taste and cultivation regardless of how business rivals viewed his methods. Now that same house would be open to everyone. The Gothic rooms where Gould had raised his children would be toured by school children and tourists. The art gallery he had filled with old masters would be studied by visitors paying modest admission fees. The grounds where he had walked with his family would become a public park. Everything exclusive about Lyndhurst had been surrendered to save it from destruction. The Vanderbilts had faced the same arithmetic at the breakers. That family, too, had discovered that Gilded Age palaces couldn't survive without Gilded Age fortunes. They, too, had given their masterpiece to a preservation organization. The most exclusive spaces in American history were becoming democratic, accessible to anyone with the price of admission and interest in seeing how the other half had once lived. The mansion that Jay Gould had bought to prove he belonged among America's aristocracy would survive by belonging to everyone instead. The hatred that had followed him through his business career had faded with the decades. The controversies that had made his name synonymous with greed were now footnotes in history books. What remained was the house, the Gothic towers still rising above the Hudson, the pointed arches still framing windows that looked out over the same views Davis had designed around more than a century earlier. Lyndhurst is 187 years old. The Gothic mansion that A.J. Davis designed in 1838 still stands on its hill above the Hudson River, its towers and pointed arches unchanged from the drawings he made nearly 2 centuries ago. The limestone facade has weathered, but not crumbled. The ribbed vaulting still covers ceilings in the main rooms. The furniture Davis designed specifically for the house still occupies its original positions. The building that was meant to look ancient when it was new has actually become ancient, and it looks better for it. Approximately 50,000 visitors come to Lyndhurst each year. They drive up the winding entrance road past the linden trees that gave the estate its name. They park in lots that once held carriages. They pay admission and collect audio guides and begin their tours through rooms that three different families called home, across a century and a quarter. The tours tell all three stories. William Paulding commissioned the original house. George Merritt expanded it. Jay Gould filled it with art and orchids and raised his children there. Each family left marks on the property. Each contributed to what visitors experience today. The guides explain the architecture, the furnishings, the social context. They describe how wealthy Americans lived in different eras, how fashions changed, how fortunes rose and fell. The Gould years receive particular attention. Visitors are fascinated by the contrast between Jay's public reputation and his private life. The man newspapers called the most hated in America walked these Gothic corridors as a devoted father and orchid enthusiast. The Black Friday schemer read to his children under medieval-style ceilings. The railroad manipulator tended tropical flowers in his massive greenhouse. The complexity makes better storytelling than simple villainy. The art gallery still stretches 100 feet along its wing. The paintings Gould collected hang in approximately their original positions. The skylights still flood the space with natural illumination. Visitors walk through and try to imagine what it meant for a despised man to surround himself with such beauty. Was it camouflage? Was it genuine appreciation? Was it simply another form of competition? Another market to corner? The greenhouse complex has been partially restored. Fire destroyed much of it in the 20th century, but the National Trust rebuilt sections to demonstrate what Gould's orchid operation looked like at its peak. The 8,000 plants are gone. The coal-fired heating systems that kept tropical temperatures through Hudson Valley winters are gone. But the structure survives, a reminder of an obsession that consumed vast resources in pursuit of beauty. The grounds remain largely as Davis and subsequent landscape designers intended. Paths wind through the 67 acres. Views of the Hudson open at carefully composed angles. The Gothic tower still rises above the trees visible from the river below. In autumn, the foliage turns colors around the gray limestone, creating images that could illustrate fairy tales or horror stories, depending on your imagination. The comparison with Newport's breakers is inevitable. Both properties represent Gilded Age excess, preserved for public viewing. Both belong to families that built fortunes in railroads and lost control of those fortunes over subsequent generations. Both were donated to preservation organizations when private maintenance became impossible. Both survive because they were given away. But the differences are significant. The Breakers draws over 300,000 visitors annually, 6 times Lyndhurst's total. The Vanderbilt name still carries recognition that the Gould name lacks. The Newport Mansion sits in a resort town with multiple historic properties competing for tourist attention. Lyndhurst stands somewhat isolated along the Hudson, easier to miss unless you're specifically looking for it. The architectural significance also differs. The Breakers represents the peak of Gilded Age display, Richard Morris Hunt's interpretation of Italian Renaissance splendor executed in marble and platinum and crystal. It was designed to overwhelm visitors with evidence of unlimited wealth. Lyndhurst represents something older and stranger, A.J. Davis's Gothic revival vision, from decades before the Gilded Age existed. It was designed to suggest age and permanence rather than immediate wealth. Historians consider Lyndhurst the more important building. Davis was America's greatest domestic architect of the mid-19th century. Lyndhurst was his masterpiece, the fullest expression of his ideas about how Gothic forms could serve American residential needs. The house influenced countless later buildings. Its survival matters for architectural history in ways that go beyond any individual family's story. The Gould legacy has faded more completely than the Vanderbilt legacy. When people think of Gilded Age excess, they imagine Newport and the Breakers before they imagine Lyndhurst. Jay Gould's name appears in history books about railroad development and financial manipulation, but he's not the cultural reference that Vanderbilt has become. His hatred has been forgotten, along with his fame. He's become a footnote, mentioned when explaining how Gilded Age capitalism worked, then passed over for more familiar figures. This might be the strangest irony of all. Jay Gould spent his life being despised. The Vanderbilts and their allies made hating him into a social requirement. Newspapers competed to publish the most damning accounts of his schemes. He couldn't enter polite society no matter how much money he accumulated. The hatred defined his public existence. Now that hatred has evaporated. Visitors to Lyndhurst learn about Gould as one interesting figure among many in the house's history. They don't arrive angry. They don't leave disgusted. They think about him the way they think about any historical character, as someone from another time whose choices and circumstances are interesting to understand but don't require emotional investment. The Vanderbilts, meanwhile, remain famous. Their name still signifies wealth and status. The Breakers still draws crowds who want to see what the richest family in America once built. The hatred they directed at Gould has been completely forgotten. They won the social battle during their lifetimes, but their victory preserved their fame, while his defeat allowed him to fade into obscurity. Both families lost their fortunes. Both families gave away their mansions. Both families discovered that Gilded Age wealth couldn't survive the 20th century's taxes and divisions and changing economics. The Vanderbilts built to prove their supremacy. Gould built to prove he belonged. Neither goal survived the generations. What survived were the buildings themselves, empty of their original purposes, filled with tourists instead of families. Lyndhurst stands on its hill overlooking the Hudson River. The Gothic towers still rise above the trees. The pointed arches still frame windows looking out at views that haven't changed in nearly 2 centuries. Inside, the rooms that Jay Gould filled with art and children and the quiet rhythms of family life wait for their next visitors. The most hated man in America built something beautiful enough to outlast the hatred. His enemies' contempt has disappeared. His victims' grievances have been forgotten. His schemes and manipulations are case studies in history courses, not ongoing outrages. What remains is the house, preserved because it was given away, open to everyone because no one could afford to keep it exclusive. The building endures. The hatred doesn't. That might be the only lesson worth taking from the story of Lyndhurst and the man the Vanderbilts despised. Monuments outlast the emotions that inspired them. Beauty survives when anger fades. The Gothic towers that Jay Gould purchased to prove his worth will still be standing when no one remembers why anyone ever thought his worth required proof.